Hello guys and welcome back to FATBOSS TV. Today we're back for more raid testing on the 7.3 PTR, and today we bring you the final boss of the entire expansion, probably, Argus the Unmaker from Antorus, the Burning Throne.
Yes, this is the last boss in this 11 boss instance, and it has 4 distinct phases, and we actually got to see all of them, so we can show you the entire fight today. And this fight is very visually impressive, and although it does have a fair amount of RP, which we usually don't like, this one is definitely an exception to the rule.
Now before we get into all the fun stuff, just as a quick disclaimer, this footage is from the PTR, so things are subject to change, although usually they don't change much, if at all. Either way, there'll be a full guide for this encounter on our channel as soon as we kill it on live servers in that first week. But let's kick it off, let's talk about Phase 1.
Now Phase 1 revolves around the idea of placing patches of death fog around the encounter in space-saving locations. Death Fog is pretty much goo that spawns from 2 of his abilities, and this goo does a ton of damage and lasts throughout the entire phase. Now the primary goo spewing ability is Cone of Death. Each time the boss reaches 100% energy, he will target a random non-tank player's location and place Death Fog in a cone at that location. We found that having all players stacked up behind the boss allowed us to easily sidestep the ability. This also allowed us to place the Cone of Death exactly where we wanted it, as all valid targets were on top of each other. For each Cone of Death that comes in afterwards, we just had all players stacked directly next to the previous Death Fog patch. That way we maximise the amount of space, and therefore time, we had in this phase. Positioning the boss nearer the edge of the room and then moving him slightly after each cone also gave us a lot more time in this phase. However, eventually we found that it wasn't needed with our DPS. But on live, and depending on your DPS, you may want to have the boss close to the edge to have that extra space and time. The other ability that causes Death Fog to spawn is Soul Blight Orb. The boss summons an untargetable orb that will send out a few debuffs in a staggered way and then despawn. The Soul Blight debuff it leaves on players deals ticking damage over 8 seconds. When this debuff expires, the player will spawn a patch of Death Fog underneath themselves. We had the Soul Blight players move directly behind the group to drop the debuff. It is important that they do not go ahead of the group if the Cone of Death is due to come in, as it may target them instead, which is likely to catch out some players. It's just important that the debuff players pay attention to the Cone of Death timer and move with the group, and never ahead of them.
Argus has a few other abilities that you need to deal with in this phase. Every now and then he'll cast Tortured Rage, which is just a flat burst of damage to the entire raid. This isn't enough to kill anyone, however with players with a Soul Blight debuff they will need extra attention from your healers. If a Cone of Death is about to come in afterwards, it may be worth using a healing cooldown to make sure that everyone's topped off. It certainly helped us out a lot, especially for the players that accidentally got clipped by any of the cone damage. On top of this bursting AoE damage on the raid, you might have noticed that the tanks are also facing the boss away at all times for Sweeping Scythe. This is a large damage cleave in a semicircle in front of the boss, which deals a massive amount of physical damage, and leaves a debuff that increases the damage you take from this ability by 150% for 15 seconds. As long as absolutely no one is in front of the boss apart from a single tank, this ability more or less just acts as a tank swap. We usually swapped around 3 stacks, using cooldowns on later stacks.
Now during this phase, Golganeth will help out by placing out 2 debuffs, each one on a single player. The debuffs last around 5 seconds and place an orb above the player's head, 1 white and 1 lightning. After the debuffs expire, the orbs will spawn at the location of those players. Running into a white orb will give a player 2k haste and versatility for 30 seconds, and running into the lightning orb gives 2k mastery and crit for 30 seconds. Now these buffs are mutually exclusive, so you can't have both. As an example, if you run into the lightning after gaining the haste verse buff, you'll lose that buff and gain the mastery crit one instead. So you want to decide what buff is best for your class and try and gain that buff each time the orb appears. This way you can actually get the buff to stack, and depending on the length of the phase you can get 6 or even 7 stacks. We decided to have the white orb always right underneath the boss, while the lightning orb was just a little bit further back. This way melee could still choose what buff they wanted whilst damaging the boss. But as long as people stayed together with the Cone of Death movement, everybody was able to keep their buff up, apart from people who had unlucky timing with the Soul Blight debuff.
So aside from those abilities, you just continue to rotate the boss around for each cone, facing the boss away and taunting on 3, whilst moving out the Soul Blight debuff and gaining the stat buff whenever you can. And once the boss reaches 70% health, Phase 2 begins. At the beginning of the phase, the boss will no longer cast any abilities. Instead, Golganeth will create a storm that will clear all the Death Fog in the room. The big lightning storm around the room deals a ton of damage, so it's really important that your entire raid moves into the middle of the room until the storm has ended. From the start, you need to make sure that no one is in front of the boss apart from the tank, because as soon as the boss reactivates, he'll go straight back into using his sweeping scythe ability from phase 1, and you deal with it the exact same way, just keep taunting around 3 stacks, but he'll no longer have any of his other abilities from phase 1, so you've got brand new things to deal with.
One of these new things to deal with is Edge of Obliteration. Throughout the phase, scythes will spawn in random locations around the encounter area. They'll hover there for a second and then start spinning, and then they'll mark a line on the floor, and after a few seconds they'll fly down that line. This knocks back, deals damage, and leaves a 12-second dot on anyone in its path, so just make sure you move out of the lines on the floor. To start off with, this is pretty easy, but as the phase goes on, more and more of them do spawn. It doesn't get super crazy or anything like that, just make sure you're paying attention to the ground. Now the main ability you need to deal with in phase 2 is Volatile Soul. Once Argus reaches 100% energy, he'll apply Soul Burst to 2 players and Soul Bomb to 1 player. Now Soul Burst lasts 15 seconds and deals a small amount of ticking damage to the player. Once it expires, that player will explode, dealing a burst of damage to themselves and to the rest of the raid. However, this raid-wide damage drops off with distance, maxing out at 45 yards. So the Soul Burst players want to move around 45 yards away from the group and each other and then explode. We decided to place the boss against the western wall and have the rest of the raid stacked up behind him. We'll then have the Soul Burst players go to the southern and the eastern wall. This makes the gap between the Soul Burst players and the raid at least 40 yards, making the explosion damage much more manageable. The reason we left a gap in the north is so that the Soul Bomb player can go over there. Soul Bomb is pretty much a souped up version of Soul Burst. It lasts 15 seconds and deals slightly higher ticking damage, however once it expires, the explosion deals 10 million damage rather than the 2 mil damage from the Soul Burst. This damage still drops off with distance, so the Soul Bomb player needs to go 45 yards away from the raid, up on the northern side of the room. This will allow the raid and the Soul Burst players to survive, however the Soul Bomb player will just flat out die, as they take the full damage from their own explosion. Fortunately, the tanks will frequently receive Agrimar's aid, through a 1 minute long debuff called Avatar of Agrimar. This increases the tank's health by 100% and movement speed by 40%, but most importantly, it causes any damage taken by nearby players to be redirected to that tank. The Avatar buff tank needs to run over to the Soul Bomb player in the north and stand next to them. This will cause the Soul Bomb player to take no damage from their explosion, whilst the tank can pop a personal and survive both of the hits with the increased health pool. Now, after all the Volatile Soul debuffs have expired, the raid should re-stack up and the phase kind of repeats from there. We found that healers should focus on keeping the tanks alive after the explosions before switching to the raid, as the raid is not going to be taking any unavoidable damage for a while until the boss reaches 50% energy. Each time he does reach this energy threshold, he will apply 2 Soul Burst debuffs with no Soul Bombs, it's just the 2 small ones. We decided to have those players move to the same locations that they usually would, with one going to the south and one going to the east. And apart from that, there's nothing else really going on in this phase. You just need to keep dealing with these Volatile Soul debuffs whilst dodging the scythes the boss is throwing at you, and eventually Argus will get to 40% health and phase 3 will begin.
At which point Argus would dash into the middle of the room and become unattackable. Amonful will cast Temporal Blast on Argus, causing him to split into a load of stars. These stars will then fly around the room and turn into 7 adds. You need to kill absolutely every single one of these adds before you can transition into phase 4. Now, absolutely every single one of these adds have 3 casts that they will do. Cosmic Ray will mark a player in the raid and point a beam towards them, and a moment later, the beam will then go off, dealing damage to anyone within it. We had everyone around the middle of the room so that all the adds can be attacked easily, and anyone that was targeted by a beam simply made sure that they weren't in anyone else's beam, and then just stood still. This gave everyone the opportunity to easily sidestep any of the casts. Another cast they do is Star Blast. This is an interruptible cast that they simply spam, and all it does is just a small burst of damage to a random player. We found it very important not to interrupt this cast, as every time one of these adds is interrupted, it'll actually become immune to interrupts for 20 seconds, which is really bad if they decide to cast a Cosmic Beacon within those 20 seconds. This ability will mark a random player, and after so long, the entire raid will then just suddenly take a burst of damage and receive a nasty 6-second dot. Generally speaking, this is cast on 2 adds at the exact same time, and if neither of them are interrupted, the combined damage of both the Cosmic Beacons will definitely wipe you. So we assigned 1 player per add to cover all of the Cosmic Beacon casts. Apart from all of those casts, occasionally 2 random adds would gain weapons. One would gain Blade of the Eternal, which made it so it dealt 300% melee damage, and the other would gain Sword of the Cosmos, which increases its melee damage by 200%, but also gave it an aura which increased the damage of all adds within 20 yards by 20% for 3 minutes. Whilst the adds have the weapons, they can be moved around and they will not cast any of the usual abilities. Each ad needs to have a tank, and the tanks need to be very quick in picking them up, as the ads have already been generating an aggro table based on the damage they have taken whilst weaponless. The Blade of the Eternal ad needs to be moved to a non-weapon ad so that DPS can just cleave them down, whereas the Sword of the FATBOSS ad needs to be tanked away from any of the ads so its aura doesn't buff them. We decided to simply tank it in the middle of the room. Now the last thing for you to know about these particular ads is that they can just swap with other ads in the room, meaning that they'll completely lose their weapons and the other ads will gain them instead. When this happens, you just need to react to them like you just did the first time round, but just make sure that you're very quick in doing so. There's nothing stopping one of the ads that have just gained the weapon to just randomly go over and hit one of your DPS. It sucks, but that's just how they seem to have designed it. The last thing to know about this phase is about 15 seconds after all the ads have spawned, nigh-impenetrable will actually decide to help you by putting debuffs on each of the ads. These debuffs increase the damage that ad takes from a single school of magic by 200%. As an example, one will take more fire damage, one will take more frost damage, one will take more nature damage, so it's vital that DPS keep an eye on these debuffs so they know where their damage is going to be the best. But apart from that, there's not really much else to really know in this phase. It was just kill the ads and make sure you interrupt the Cosmic Beacon cast, as well as dodging the beams. Apart from that, it was pretty simple.
Yeah, and once all the ads do die, phase 4 begins, and we do take a trip into Final Fantasy for a really cool looking transition. He'll pick everyone up, fill you with blades, and then kill everyone with a single sweep, removing your food buffs, augment runes, and resetting your potion timers. So you want to double pop before you get to this place. Shortly afterwards, Inar will just go crazy tree mode and spawn a single tree at the side of the room. This tree actually spawned in different locations both times we got to this phase. At this point, everybody, including people who died before the transition, can now release and move around the encounter area as a ghost. Inside the Ghost Realm, there are a bunch of little hungering soul ads wandering about. You want to avoid these as they'll knock you back and slow you if you come into contact with them. This will make it take a lot longer for you to get to the tree, which you really want to do because running over to the tree will res you and allow you to engage Argus again. Now this needs to be done relatively quickly at the beginning of the phase, as Argus is casting End of All Things when nobody is alive. This long cast will apparently, according to the Dungeon Journal, end creation and kill everything. So yeah, it's probably best that you interrupt that before it goes off. However, before you do interrupt it, make sure there is a tank available because he will immediately become active. Now before talking more about Argus and this phase, let's cover some more information about this tree. Now this tree will allow anyone who dies from this point on to release as a ghost and resurrect. However, the tree itself has an energy bar, which depletes each time a person is rezzed. And this energy does not come back. Once it's all gone, it's gone for good. Players can actually still use the energyless tree to res, but instead of removing energy, which of course is now all gone, the tree will now gain a permanent hard-hitting dot which stacks up each time a person uses it to resurrect. Now the healers can heal the tree to try and keep it healthy, however if a lot of people use the tree and it has no energy, it's gonna die really fast. Because of this, you do have a limited amount of reses that you can use in this phase. This means you cannot rely on the tree to cover people's mistakes. Instead, death itself has become a resource you want to use. You want certain people to die at certain times, and if you ever run out of reses, it's super likely you're gonna wipe. With that out of the way, let's talk about what else is going on in this phase. Now the boss will spawn re-origination modules around the edges of the room, and these are ads that will slowly drain their own health whilst making an ever-growing circle. Once they do run out of health, they'll explode after a couple of seconds. This deals a flat amount of damage to the raid and a near lethal amount of damage to anyone within the circle. You need to damage these ads so the circles will not grow too large. They don't have a ton of health, so killing them quickly isn't a huge deal with all DPS swapped to them. However, each time the ads spawn, they'll have their numbers increased by 1. So you'll start off by killing 3 of these ads, and you'll probably end up at the end of the phase killing maybe 6 or 7 each wave. Now their explosion will leave motes of titanic power within the Ghost Realm. Dead players who are in ghost form can run over to these and absorb them. This will give Sargeras energy. He's like sitting on his throne trying to cast. Once he has 20 energy, he will buff the raid with Titan Forged, increasing their damage, healing, and movement speed. And this buff gets stronger the longer Sargeras has 20 plus energy. We didn't actually get to see much of this buff, but as you can tell, it's insanely useful. So players who do die want to go around and collect these motes before using the tree to res. For the tanks, Sweeping Scythe has been replaced by Deadly Scythe. It still does the same damage, however the debuff increases the damage taken by 200% rather than 150%, and now it is permanent. This means eventually the tank will die, however the debuff is removed upon death. So we decided to have a single tank take as many hits as possible, and when he dies, he can then just release and then pick up the boss when the other tank eventually dies. As there's no crazy rush to get back to life, this actually serves as a good time for that tank to go around and pick up any motes of titanic power to give the raid Titan Forged. Volatile Soul still happens in this phase when the boss reaches 100% energy. He'll place out the 2 small and 1 large debuffs, and at 50 energy, he'll place out the 2 small debuffs. We decided to have the debuffs just go into the standard phase 2 debuff positions. The Soul Bomb player will flat out just die without a huge personal or an immunity, as there is no tank debuff to save them. This player can take this time when they're dead to once again run around and pick up as many motes as possible before coming back to life at the tree. We decided to have the raid stacked up behind the boss, who should be against the wall, to help maximize the distance the debuffs have to drop their damage. Being stacked also helps with Tortured Rage, which has made a return from phase 1. Of course, this AoE damage hurts, and with other sources of damage, you'll definitely want to consider having a healing cooldown to cover each and every one. And on top of this, while you're dealing with all of those mechanics, you're going to have Embers of Rage falling from the sky. These are just little swirly circles that if you stand in them, they do a burst of damage to you and apply a really nasty dot. So yeah, move from those.
And that's about it for this phase. Although we didn't really get to see as much as we wanted to, it seems like you really just want to kill the adds around the edges of the room and then have dead people pick up the motes that those particular adds leave within the Ghost World. You want to place the Volatile Soul debuffs away from the raid and then sacrifice or immune the Soul Bomb player. You want to have tanks take the Deadly Scythe until they get flat out one-shot, whilst using healing cooldowns on the Tortured Rage, while dodging all the Embers of Rage, and then keeping the tree alive as long as possible. It's a lot going on.
It's simple, easy. But yeah, it's a really cool fight. Going into our feedbacks, of course, that is the encounter. I would say overall this fight is very, very solid though. It did feel very good.
It was fun to test.
It was very fun to test. The main thing I like about it is that each phase definitely feels different from one another, meaning that you don't get too bored. Talking about something like KJ, which is the last end boss that we fought up against, his first phase and his second phase do feel very similar.
Yes.
Whereas on this fight, phase 1 you're dealing with loads of black goo on the floor, the second phase you're dealing with these horrible bombs and sighs, the third phase you're fighting stars, and then phase 4 you're running around as ghosts. Yeah. So there's a very wide spectrum of what you're doing.
There's a clear distinction between the phases. That doesn't, however, mean that all the phases are great. No. Phase 1 I think is fine. It's quite a short phase, especially if you lost the pool. However, phase 2 I wouldn't say is that impressive. Really the only thing you're doing there is placing bombs at the side of the room that only affects so many players in your, well, it affects 2 or 3 players in your raid, while everyone else is just dodging these scythes. And right at the start of the phase, I mean obviously as intended, it's not that difficult to do. And the idea is towards the end of the phase there's loads of scythes up, but that really never happened. It never felt like, holy shit, there's so many scythes, I'm struggling to keep out of them.
Yeah.
It just seemed like maybe that could be ramped up even further than it was. And I hope that's something they do before live servers, so that phase actually feels like there's a little bit more going on than just bombs every now and then. I think one other mechanic can be added to that phase, honestly.
Well, the thing is that there is no overlaps in that phase. It's very, very repetitive, which means that there's no thing like, oh, how are we going to deal with it next time? Well, we literally just dealt with it this time. So it's just the same every single time. So there's no real tension building up. Like the size, they telegraph their attacks. They give you so long to move out of them. It's not like crazy reaction times are needed. So it's literally like, oh, boss is getting 100 energy.
And it's super easy to gauge exactly when the bombs are coming in, even without boss mods, because they come on energy.
Yeah, and the energy is just very, very steadily going up and then resetting and then going up again. So yeah, phase 2, I must admit, is a little bit simple in comparison to other phases. But what they could be doing with this phase is teaching you how to deal with the soul burst and the soul bomb, because when you're in phase 4 and you're dealing with that on top of everything else, it might be a little bit overwhelming for someone just entering that phase with so many new mechanics.
Sure, I understand that, but phase 2 is so underwhelming, perhaps they could teach you one more mechanic from phase 4 and phase 2, such as the rains.
Maybe, they could have those rains of Ember coming down or something.
I think that'd
like
be cool.
Talking about phase 3, I think it is a neat little phase. It's certainly different. It breaks it up without being like a boring intermission. I must admit, the last couple of intermissions we've had on end bosses, like especially the phase 1 intermission on KJ, it feels like I'm like down talking KJ the whole time. I do like that fight, but the intermission in this is very active, and each person has a different role as well, which I kind of like. So you've got the multi-dotters going absolutely nuts, and then you've got people who do, like, I know, fire-only damage or just finding the fire ad. popping combust and then going, okay, that ad doesn't exist anymore. So there's a lot of huge numbers, and people really enjoy doing huge numbers. So I think that's a nice little addition.
One thing about the phase though, however, that is a bit of an issue for me is I don't like the way that the ads change. Of course, once the first set of ads picks up the weapon, that alone for the tanks to identify and pick them up before they've gone and swung someone in the face is kind of difficult. But because they change periodically throughout the fight, there is absolutely no grace period for any melee DPS that are currently DPSing ranged ones. Because let's just say they're top of the range threat meter, well, that doesn't matter, they're just casting. But if they suddenly swap, they just get insta-swung in the face and they're dead.
Yeah.
That seems really dumb. I feel like they need to introduce some sort of grace period of at least a couple of seconds just to notify any nearby melee DPS, I'm about to turn into a melee dude, you better get out of the way of me.
Yeah, exactly.
And also, it gives the tank the notification, or maybe I should go over there and taunt it.
Exactly, yeah. Just telling everyone, I'm going to be big and spooky, do your jobs. Yeah, instead of just suddenly going, oh, I'm here and you're dead. Which, to be honest, isn't a big deal if you die in this phase.
I mean,
because
eventually you'll get timers and you'll know exactly you can move away from that person.
Dying in this phase doesn't matter because you're about to go into phase 4 anyway. If one or two people do die, which normally happen to us for any odd reason, it doesn't matter because going into phase 4, how cool is that? Having a mechanic around the idea is that you're supposed to die and you're using death as a resource.
Yeah, it seems to be like a reoccurring thing, especially this expansion of bringing in new gimmicks in raids.
The last two ones have at least.
The last two, yeah. I mean, of course, the last one was the soak mechanic. No one had ever seen that before. Of course, I'm joking. We're talking about the dark phase.
Yeah.
On KJ. That's pretty cool. They've actually reused that in this instance for one of the particular bosses, the Port Keeper, which is pretty cool. But yeah, death. This is a new thing. I don't think we've actually seen this before in a raid.
Yeah, releasing and running around the encounter area is a really, really unique idea. And like the idea of using death and then doing a different job when you do die. You can use it to reset debuffs on you if you're the tank. All that kind of stuff is amazing. But the thing is, old habits die super hard. Because when people died on this fight, they just forgot to release.
All the weak auras popping up. Don't release.
Yeah,
don't
exactly.
Release.
You're going to have to get rid of those 100%. Talking of things to get rid of, hopefully these things do get resolved because there are a couple of bugs with this fight.
Yep.
The storm in the phase 1 to phase 2 transition continued to deal damage for a couple of seconds after the storm had disappeared. So the animation is gone. You're like, oh, let's spread out. And you run into a storm that's still doing damage. Yep. So hopefully that does get fixed. In phase 3, the ads around the edge would sometimes melee hit nearby DPS even when they didn't have weapons, which I'm not sure if that's particularly intended.
Doesn't sound right.
So it seemed a little bit odd at least. And lastly, when you release in phase 4, sometimes you just, res
instantly
with full health.
Res. You don't even need to go to the tree.
Yeah, you just res, and it's like, ta-da, and it's like, oh, okay. So that
might be something they need to look at.
Yeah, a little bit funky. Yeah, but either way, overall, aside from phase 2, which, as we said, does feel a little bit slow maybe, it is a really, really solid encounter. The visuals on it are amazing. The RP on it, even for people like us who don't particularly like RP, it is really cool.
It is very cool. But thank you very much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this little boss preview, then do drop us down a like. It helps us out a lot. And before we do go, as always, we'd like to give a huge thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You guys are absolutely fantastic. We appreciate everything you do for us. And we shall see you all in the next video.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.